It's been criticised, this investigation, as being a whitewash, was it?
Oh, I don't think it's a whitewash. I think there were certainly difficulties with it and difficulties in reviewing and analysing the data that was provided by the Chinese. Now, how political folk interpret this one way or the other, be it Chinese or from outside, is sort of outside my expertise.
One of the criticisms was that you weren't given all the sewerage data that you requested. How crucial could that have been?
Well, look, it's not quite incorrect. I mean, sewerage is certainly used in Australia and overseas countries for trying to establish if there's unrecognised transmission of the SARS coronavirus. The Chinese do sewerage analyses for other things, but samples available from back in 2019, which was admittedly over a year ago, were no longer available. So we have to accept that on face value.
Yep, we have to take a lot of things at face value when it comes to the Chinese regime, because we know how tightly controlled the regime likes to run things there. So in that context, this report, do we take it with a grain of salt?
No, I think the report's very reasonable and certainly summarises what data was made available to us, and that's really the key. The data that was analysed by the WHO team was very useful and certainly much more than China had ever given WHO or anyone else before. Now, the question is whether all of the data was provided, and that's really hard to answer and may not have been. So we're kind of stuck in that situation.
Do you suspect all the data wasn't provided to you?
Well, we certainly asked for data from the Chinese, in particular around the first 174 cases that had been described in December 2019, right at the very beginning, and that wasn't provided. The results were provided by them, but not what we call the line listing, each individual patient, that would have allowed us to analyse ourselves what had happened at that time.
China, in providing you only the information, I guess, that they saw fit or could provide, can you understand why people think it's just been manipulated by China?
Well, look, I think it's a mixture of things. I think some of the data isn't actually available. Some of the data may well have not been provided. And you've got to remember also that this was occurring in a context of great difficulty and so on in Wuhan. And so trying to get the data you really need for an outbreak investigation may have actually been very difficult at the time. Now, that might be being seen as charitable, but I think it's important to bear that in mind.
We look at the results and it's likely some form of animal jumping to a human at some stage. The lab leak has been really all but ruled out. But did you have enough data to do that conclusively?
Well, look, we know from the history of infectious diseases, including with these coronaviruses, that the link from an animal, a bat maybe, to an animal of some description into humans is a typical way that these things move into humans. Now, the laboratory leak, you can never completely exclude it, but based on the evidence of how uncommon this normally is and the data and information provided by the Chinese, I think it's actually highly unlikely that it was a laboratory leak. Always possible, but based on the data we saw, highly unlikely.
If it was a laboratory leak, do you accept that the Chinese would have done everything to cover that up?
Well, if it was a leak, then they may well have tried to cover it up. One could argue that the responses to this pandemic very early in the piece, in terms of things like human-to-human transmission and so on, was delayed in getting out to the general population of China, of course, but also to international agencies around the world. So there may be criticism there to be sheeted home, but that's not quite what the focus of the WHO team was. We're about the science of the first introduction into humans.
Now you're back home now. We can say that you're safely back home. Were there any tense moments in China? Is there anything you'd say now that you wouldn't have said there?
No, we had some pretty vigorous debates with our Chinese colleagues on the other side of the table and some arguments and so on about what the data meant, what the conclusions were, and why wasn't certain pieces of data available. But at no stage was there any sort of malign influence on either me as an Australian or on anybody else. I think the Chinese were much more open than they may have been in the past. But whether that's quite what we expect is a different matter.
Dr. Dominic Dwyer, appreciate your time. We'll speak soon.
Thank you very much. Good. Bye-bye.